Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry, as the last few people come in and take their seats and as our speakers get organized, I want to welcome all of you. My name is Hadar Harris, and I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Law. We're very happy to have all of you here today for our very important discussion on mass shootings and mental disability rights in the United States, a topic that we'll clearly hear and explore in depth over the next hour and a half. Prior to starting the event and turning it over to Lauren Bartlett, who will be moderating today, I wanted to just say a word of welcome both to those of you who are in the room and those of you who are watching on live webcast. For those of you who are watching on webcast, we do have the ability for you to ask questions and to interact with us through sending questions to HUMLAW, HUMLAW, at wcl.american.edu. You will hear that. We don't have the ability to flash that for you on the webcast, but you will hear that address several times. We want to thank the members of the Center's Student Advisory Board and our Dean's Fellows who are moderating the email address today, and to thank the people who helped to set today's event up. A couple of announcements about upcoming events, just so that this is on people's radar screens. For those of you who are here at American University, we will be holding an interactive training this coming Friday, March 1st, on the use of Human Rights Yes, a handbook around the implementation and effective adoption of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Janet Lord and Allison DeFranco, who are co-authors of that handbook, will be leading the training. For those of you who are interested, we have only a limited space for that training. Please come to talk to us after the event because we do require registration if you are interested in attending. Also, next Wednesday, March 6th, we have a day-long conference coming up as part of our initiative in Human Rights in Business, a reflection on the Montreux Principles +5. This is assessing the current status of the development and implementation of international standards for the private military and security industry around the world. We are 5 years out from a set of voluntary principles that were developed around human rights implementation or human rights standards for private military and security contractors. We will have experts here from around the world to discuss how far those provisions have gone and what is envisioned for further implementation of those principles in the future. There are a wide variety of events coming up over the next couple of months that the Center is running. If you would like information about it, if you are not yet on our Facebook, if you are not friends with us on Facebook, please friend us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter and sign up for the Center's listserv. Information about that can be found at the Center's website as well as on the table out in front. So with those announcements, I want to thank my colleague Lauren Bartlett, who is the director of our program on human rights in the United States and the director of our local human rights lawyering project. This event was at her initiative, thinking that the conversation around mental disability and in the wake of gun violence was a very important one to have and to consider as a topic in and of itself. And so this event is at her initiative, and at this point I would like to hand it over to Lauren to moderate the rest of the event. Again, thank you all for coming.
Thanks, Hadar. So here we are at the Mass Shootings and Disability Rights in the United States event. I want to say just a couple more thank yous. I want to say thank you so much to Aaron and Samir and also to Ashley, who are our Dean's Fellows at the Center, who helped put together this event, and this wouldn't have been possible without them. So thank you so much. So the recent tragedies in Newtown, Connecticut, Aurora, Colorado, Tucson, Arizona, have sparked a national debate, maybe even international, over how best to prevent future mass shootings, as well as the link between mass shootings, gun control, and persons with disabilities. Recently proposed legislation at the national and state level includes controversial provisions such as those to disqualify the mentally ill entirely from possessing firearms, and also to require mandatory reporting for mental health providers of patients who pose a serious risk to self or others. Today our discussion will focus at the intersection of the need to prevent mass shootings, gun control, and how to ensure the protection of the human rights of persons with disabilities, including the right to liberty, the right to non-discrimination, and more. So I'm going to first introduce our 4 speakers. Thank you so much to our 4 speakers for joining us today. I'm going to give them each about 15 minutes to give a presentation, and then there'll be time for questions at the end. For those of you in the room, we have microphones set up. You can feel free to ask your questions there. For those of you who are watching via live webcast, again, you can submit your questions to humlaw@wcl.american.edu. Our staff will be checking the email account regularly and bringing questions up for me to ask to our panelists. So let me go ahead and introduce our 4 panelists. I'm going to do so just briefly. There's more about our panelists on our website. First, we have Professor Robert Dinnerstein. He's the Director of Clinical Education, Associate Dean for Experimental Education, and Director of the Disability Rights Clinic here at American University Washington College of Law. Professor Dinnerstein has taught at WCL since 1983. He has an A.B. degree from Cornell University and a J.D. degree from Yale Law School. Last week, on February 20th, Professor Dinnerstein was featured on the PBS Frontline documentary, The Path to Violence, on this very topic. Next, we have Sherry Trafford. Sherry is a staff attorney in the Mental Health Division at the Public Defender Service for the District of Columbia, where she represents respondents in civil mental health commitment and detention cases, and NGI equities in post-disposition release hearings. From 1999 to 2004, she was a staff attorney in the Civil Division at the Public Defender Service. She received her JD from Yale Law School and received her undergraduate degree from Indiana University. We have next Ira Burnham. Ira is the legal director of the Judge David L. Bazelon Center for Mental Health Law, where he has worked since 1988. He is recognized for his experience in policy and legal issues related to Americans with Disabilities Act and community mental health care, Medicaid, and children's issues. He consults with federal agencies, state policymakers, and advocates. Working with Disability Rights International and Mental Disability Advocacy Center, he has advised advocates and policymakers in Hungary, the Czech Republic, Albania, Romania, Ukraine, Russia, and Japan. Mr. Burnham earned his JD at Harvard Law School. Lastly, we have Anupa Iyer. Anupa is completing a fellowship on violence against women with intellectual disabilities in South Africa. She is also the global coordinator for Disabled Peoples International's Global Youth Network. Prior, Anupa worked as a legal intern at Disability Rights Washington in Seattle, Washington, as well as the Judge David L. Bazelon Center for Mental Health Law and the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. She earned her JD with a concentration in disability and international law from Seattle University School of Law and has a bachelor's in political science from the University of California, Los Angeles. So thanks again to our panelists, and I'm going to turn it over to Professor Robert Dinnerstein, who's going to start us off, if that's okay with you.
I thought that was last. Sorry. That's fine. Thank you, Lauren. It's tempting to say, with regard to this issue, what's the big deal? And of course, at some level, from a societal standpoint, the big deal seems obvious. We've gotten, as Lauren indicated, some horrific crimes recently. They seem to be coming more frequently. That's probably not true from a statistical standpoint, but in our public perception, the time between the Virginia Tech and Columbine and Aurora and Newtown events, which take on meaning just by using the one word that describes them, are troubling. The problem is, how do we address it as a society in ways that take adequate account of the rights of individuals to live their lives in the world, and the need to protect people, protect individuals, protect the broader society. And the particular problem is that when we look at backwards from the people who are alleged to have committed these acts, and I'm using alleged in the way they do in the newspapers, they never want to really say it, pretty clear in most of these cases who the actual shooters were, even if some of them have not yet, some of them were not convicted of that. And what we find is, a range of characteristics. They're usually male, they're usually white, they're often young in the sense of maybe early 20s. They seem to have a history of being troubled. They may or may not have a diagnosed mental disorder or psychosocial disorder. They may or may not have received treatment of some kind. They are probably people who have planned the activities they engaged in over some extensive period of time. And if all of that is true, and there's some nuances here that I'm glossing over, but even if we accept as true all those characteristics, the one thing that doesn't tell us is, could we look forward from people who seem to have those same characteristics and with any confidence say, oh, if you have all these things going, we know you are likely to commit a horrible crime such as committed at Newtown? And the answer is, we don't. And not only do we not, it's really unlikely we ever could. There are many people who would have each of the characteristics I identified who would never do anything dangerous at all. There are people who would have each of those characteristics and would do something dangerous, but nothing on the order of what we've seen in Newtown and Aurora. And the price of trying to disable, if you will, the people who might commit the kind of acts that we've seen would be such a high price that I dare say none of us in a free society would want to pay it. So the temptation to look at why can't we simply screen people better? Why can't we simply lock up everyone who is dangerousness? Why can't we monitor them carefully? Well, an understandable human desire and emotion doesn't really translate well into actual public policy. Now, having said that, I mean, it's a little bit odd, and I don't know how my other panelists feel about this. I'm not a big defender of gun rights. I probably won't be invited to the next Second Amendment symposium that we hold. And so part of me thinks, well, if, you deny certain people the right to have guns, that's probably better for the overall safety. But while that may be true as a personal belief, I don't think that's any basis on which to make policy. So that in some ways what we have to think about is there any relevant set of characteristics of people with particular disabilities that would allow us, that would encourage us to take certain steps and say, you have either forfeited your right to have guns in the way that other people do, or otherwise should be limited in some fashion in that way. The current laws, and I know Ira and others will be talking about these in terms of the efforts to respond to Newtown in particular, are trying to, in a sense, tighten up the connection between people who have received some kind of treatment and the possibility of their owning a gun or retaining a gun that they might own. And I suspect, without knowing specifically, that a lot of the criticism you'll hear from us as a group is that it's very difficult, even in the context of a session, a therapeutic session between say, a mental health therapist and an individual, to really say, oh, this person has not only said things that sound kind of dangerous, but is in a position to act on those in such a way that I should report that person. And some of the laws are looking in a way to make it easier and indeed require that greater reporting. That could sound like something that makes a lot of sense. The problem is that one of the things we also worry about is not creating standards for requiring reporting, let's say, in ways that might discourage people from actually getting services on a voluntary basis. Think about it for yourself. If you know that if you go to see somebody because you're having difficulties, you want to go to a counseling session, you might feel differently about that if you thought that the person you went to see has to report that to the bar admission authorities when you applied for bar admission after law school. It doesn't mean you won't get in, but you might think, gee, all things being equal, I'd rather not have that have to be disclosed. So that might mean you would go see somebody who isn't in that kind of reporting relationship. It also might mean that you decide not to get help. And so part of the challenge in thinking about this issue for people with mental disabilities is that there's this overarching question about the degree to which people seek services voluntarily and whether those services are available in community-based settings, which I think we'd all agree is a good thing, versus the kind of coercion that comes into play when you're talking about committing people against their will because of some reliable action that threatens violence to themselves or others. I should add a couple of things here, too. There are some aspects of risk if you have a mental illness and gun violence, but probably the greater risk, in fact, the data would suggest by far the greater risk, is of suicide rather than homicide. So again, there may be arguments for saying that we should limit the availability of guns to people who have expressed in some kind of defensible or definable way suicidal thoughts, but that really would suggest that a lot of times the real danger, the real concern is really more of concern about themselves than about other people. The other thing we know is that well, let me step back for a second. For many, many years and in many different contexts, people in the various systems in which people find themselves, criminal justice system, civil commitment system, otherwise, have been asked to predict whether somebody will engage in violent behavior. And I think that some of the later panelists will talk about this in more depth. But the fact is that we're not very good at doing that. Not only could we not have the kind of dragnet that would draw in everybody, I mean, not only if we did that would that be a big civil liberties problem, but the fact of the matter is that people who may be the most dangerous may not say anything that would suggest to you as a therapist that they're going to do that. A famous study in the 70s suggested that you had a better chance predicting violence if you flipped a coin. Later studies would suggest that with a somewhat more nuanced approaches that look more to actuarial situations rather than clinical predictions of violence, standards which look at past violence, which look at short time frames for prediction, can get better in the quality of the prediction, but they don't get great. And so as a result of that, we don't really have a lot of good information, which does not prevent lots of people getting up in court and opining that they can, with some reliability, predict dangerousness. Well, they really can't. So we can't predict it very well. The many people who, if we could predict it, would in fact not go forward and commit these kind of acts, leads, I think, to some real concerns. Now, can there be anything good that comes out of this debate? I think there could be some good, and there's some inkling that perhaps some is coming out of it, and that's this. The one thing that does seem to be across the board agreed upon by even the NRA and advocates who would pursue restrictions on guns is that there needs to be more mental health services. Now, what that means specifically, I think, varies depending on the group. But if a result of all these horrific events is that there are more that budget cuts are avoided that otherwise would come into play, which is, of course, ironic for us to be talking about this in the shadow of the upcoming sequester. But at the state level in particular, if money was put back into programs that has been cut out that would make them again available on a voluntary basis for people who might go to them if they were actually good services, that could be a good thing that comes out of it. How long that would last, whether or not there would be follow-through, whether it truly would be uncoercive, I think, are all questions that would be important to take a look at. But I think we have to also think about the extent to which we address, I guess, an overarching problem that's here as well, and that is it's not just about statistical prediction, it's not just about horrific crimes, it's about the stigma that is still very strongly associated with having a diagnosis of a mental disorder. It is not a club that people particularly want to join or be labeled as being part of. As a result of that, it is a very a prominent group, a group that is available, if you want to use some of the heuristics we talk about sometimes in cognitive psychology, to say, well, if there is something horrible that happens and if we see this characteristic, it must be these people with mental illness. We don't focus so much on children who die from gunfire because they pick up a gun that an adult has in the home, or other kinds of bases on which these crimes get committed. We also don't tend to focus on those perpetrators who don't have some kind of mental disorder in their background. That is, you don't tend to see headlines that say a man shoots 10 people, no mental health history or problems. Right? That's not the kind of headline you see. You see the reverse. So when it's there, it's prominent. When it's not there, you tend not to see it. And that becomes important for us as we think about what the real causal connection is. So in the end, if there's nothing more to say, if you come away with nothing else from this session today, I would hope you would come away with knowing that the data that would support some kind of connection between mental illness, even serious or severe mental illness, and violence is a very weak one. And to base strong public policy preventing people from having equal access, whatever you think of it, to guns on that kind of inadequate process is really something that I think we have to be very, very careful about. Thank you.
I'm going to remain sitting here. And if someone can't hear, raise your hand. She says the microphones are on, Laura says so. My name is Sherry Trafford. I'm a staff attorney in the Mental Health Division at the Public Defender Service for the District of Columbia. I've been doing civil mental health commitment work for about 7 years now. And I think what my purpose of being part of this panel is to talk to you about, to give you some grounding in what compulsory mental health treatment versus voluntary mental health treatment is, and just some information about what I see kind of on the ground dealing with people who are brought into involuntary mental health treatment on a daily basis. The first thing that I think is important to understand, first of all, I don't always think of my work as human rights law. I think of it as civil rights law, and I appreciate the fact that you are pulling this issue into a human rights issue. And it is, as an intellectual exercise, I think it's interesting to think about where our civil laws, our due process rights in the United States, in our various jurisdictions, have their grounding in human rights law as well. So I'm not prepared to talk about that, but it's an interesting idea. Civil commitment laws vary from state to state. There is not an overarching federal civil commitment law for people who have not already been convicted of a crime. So each state is going to deal with forced treatment in a different way. In the District of Columbia, we have a civil commitment law that allows people to be brought into involuntary treatment based on an allegation by a police officer, by certain trained employees of the Department of Mental Health, or even by a family member under certain circumstances making a complaint and filing a petition in court. Interestingly to me, and I think echoing some of what Professor Dinnerstein stated with respect to how these people are brought into involuntary treatment, the form that is required to get someone detained requires a description of the circumstances that the person observed. It requires a 3-line description of why this person, who could be a police officer, who could be a trained mental health Department of Mental Health employee, but not necessarily a psychiatrist or psychologist. Why does that person think that someone might have a mental illness? And again, a little 3-line description. Why does that person believe that someone might be likely to injure self or others as a result of mental illness? Based on that application, a person can be brought in D.C. to what's called CPEP, the Comprehensive Psychiatric Emergency Program. It's like the emergency room for psychiatry in D.C. The individuals can be held at CPEP indefinitely, actually, The average stay in DC is from hours, just a matter of hours, up until maybe 3 or 4 days. After 3 or 4 days, a decision is going to be made whether the person should be sent to a hospital or discharged back to the community. And the law comes into play when a person is held involuntarily up to 48 hours. If after 48 hours, the Department of Mental Health must file a petition in court getting permission to continue to detain an individual. Same thing, if a person is transported to a hospital sometime up to 48 hours after they've been detained, the hospital must file a petition seeking court permission to detain the person involuntarily. In D.C., our case law has established a very clear favor for voluntary mental health treatment. And again, Professor Dinnerstein referenced why that would be the incentive. The case law talks about how we don't want to create a legal system that discourages individuals from seeking help when they need it on their own. We don't want to create a system where individuals, once they are in a hospital, can feel that they've then been trapped in that hospital and don't have the right to request their own discharge. So to the extent possible, the law, at least in D.C., there's good law that supports the rights of individuals to try to gain their freedom or gain at least their own self-determination of voluntary status. I want to give you some statistics about this. In 2011, in the District of Columbia, there were 1,799 involuntary detention cases filed. So that means in 2011, 1,799 people were at CPEP, at the psychiatric emergency room, long enough, so up to 48 hours, to require that that DMH had to file a petition to keep them longer. Okay? I don't have statistics about how many people came to CPEP and were discharged before that 48-hour period passed. I have heard speakers from the Department of Mental Health say that the involuntary number is about half of all admissions. So imagine about 3,500 people going to CPEP, having some period of evaluation to see if there's a psychiatric emergency, a crisis that causes that person to be likely to injure self or others. Okay. In 2012, there were about 500 more involuntary cases. That's a big jump in 1 year. In 2012, there were 2,214. So far in 2013, 2 months in, we've seen 324 involuntary petitions filed. So that gets us to somewhere around 2,000 if the trend continues at this rate. I can tell you, of all of those people, let me back up. My office, Public Defender Service, ends up representing about 50% of those people. And there's a private bar that is appointed to represent the other people. Of the cases that came into my office over the last 7 years, I have probably seen one petition that said anything about a gun. So the people, first of all, in D.C., our gun rights are substantially restricted already. So even though we have Supreme Court addressing the access to the right to own guns in D.C., and there is that theoretic right, in D.C., access to guns is pretty restricted already. So I guess arguably that's why I don't see petitions that mention guns. The people who have them illegally already, I guess. The reason, though, that I focus on that fact is that in the cases of individuals who are brought in for involuntary psychiatric treatment, we are not seeing individuals who are brought in making threats to use guns to hurt themselves or other people. I don't have like science to back this up, but what I have heard from doctors as we have challenged cases in court is that it takes a fair amount of planning and organizational ability to commit crimes that involve mass harm. And the people that we see being brought in as involuntary patients in the compulsory system are usually not in a position to make those kind of plans. And I don't have science to back that up, and I don't want to be making too many generalizations. But that's been my experience. I can also tell you, giving you grounding a little again in what's happening in D.C. Of those in 2012, of the 2,200 cases that came in as involuntary patients, where people were forced to be evaluated and observed by a psychiatrist in a hospital for more than 48 hours. About 20% of those individuals challenged their detention. They have a right to have what's called a probable cause hearing. So about 20% of the people brought in asked for that hearing, that opportunity to try to gain their freedom by going in front of a judge to request that. Then the most interesting statistic, probably, to me, and maybe to you, is that of the people who challenged their detention by requesting probable cause, about half of those individuals were released before they went to the court hearing. That court hearing has to happen within 24 hours of the request. So if the person challenged their detention, the doctor, half of the time, made a decision that they did not need to go to court and try to fight to keep this person in the hospital. Of the people who went to court to challenge their detention, so of, say, the remaining 100 cases, about half of those people were ordered discharged by the judge. There was a finding of no probable cause. So that of 2,200 people, we're down to about 50 people who challenged being held in the hospital and lost their challenge. So that's a pretty significant statistic, I think. And it is, the other significant statistic is that 80% of the people being held, ultimately, they did not challenge being held involuntarily. And of those individuals, about 80% of them were discharged within a week. So involuntary hospitalization in D.C. is for short time periods, and it applies to not very many people, I guess, to put it simply. There is an entire group of people in the District of Columbia who never see my office. Professor Dennerstein listed the general statistics about people who have committed these mass shootings. I listed, listening to him, male, white, early to mid-20s. They might or might not have a diagnosis of mental illness. Again, I'm making a gross generalization here, but My clients are 90% African American. They are half and half, white and female. Their age spans range from 18 years old, when they've aged out of public schools and other systems and they haven't been connected to the mental health system, so they're kind of lacking services. So 18 up to 85 years old. Older people who are no longer able to take care of themselves and haven't had the resources put in place to assist them to stay on their own. So the people in the District of Columbia who are being detained at the request of police officers or trained mental health professionals are not the people who are committing mass shootings. That's, again, a gross generalization, but that's the law in the District of Columbia, at least, is not capturing the population that the popular media is looking at when they talk about restricting the rights of people with a diagnosis of mental illness to have access to guns. And I think that that begs the question which which Ira is going to address, which is, what population of people should we be focusing on if what we're trying to do is address mass shootings? Because it is certainly not the group of people who are being detained involuntarily in our existing mental health system. And so with that, you got to stop taking notes and start talking.
When you're third, you have to scurry around a little bit.
Okay.
Presentation. So it should work. Good afternoon. I'm Ira Burnham. I'm the legal director of the Bazelon Center for Mental Health Law here in D.C. I got an email saying that it was my 35th anniversary of being a lawyer and I should pay a lot of money for a plaque. So it occurred to me that actually I've been doing this kind of work for about 35 years. For about 10 years I did civil rights work of various kinds. In the last 25 years or so I've been doing mental health or what we would now call disability rights work. And I met Bob, I don't know, 1978 or 7. We were working on the same case, he with the Department of Justice and me at the Southern Poverty Law Center, a mental health case. What you've heard so far is pretty much the science as it exists. What we know about people with mental illness and the link to violence, what we're able to do in terms of predicting violent behavior, and particularly the difficulties of predicting who will commit mass shootings. I thought I just wanted to give some perspectives on the topic today and then look at it from a public policy perspective. First of all, what has really interested me about the current debate and the current attention to gun violence, the link between gun violence and mental illness, is what it tells us about public attitudes towards people with mental illness. It's been really, I wanted to say fascinating, maybe troubling, disturbing, but I think it has really brought into focus some of the difficulties that mental health policy and mental health policymakers face in trying to craft good approaches to help people with mental illness integrate into society and succeed in their lives. Secondly, it tells us a lot, I think, about how public policy is made. Because what's happened here is that a series of events have really captured the public attention. And I've thought just a little bit about why that's the case, why it is that mass killings, which are fairly infrequent, have so captured our attention. And I don't know if it's because it involves the mind, what is human, it's very immediate, seems random, completely without any reason or how could people do this? So there's something that has really captured our imagination. And if you look at films, literature, that character, sort of the crazed killer, is fairly prominent in both our literature, I guess more so our film. Although there are relatively few of these folks around. And of course, the damage they do, while horrific, when compared to other acts and conduct that cause loss of life, is relatively small. This is another interesting perspective. I'm probably going to get myself into some trouble, but we've had this really very focused, very passionate debate in this country on mass killings and mental illness. What can we do to prevent mass killings? It's taken a priority that may, in the end, be very good for mental health funding. Not so sure for mental health policy. But why? Why is it that all politicians are talking about this issue as opposed to, say, other issues or areas of public policy that probably have a lot greater impact on human life and even the loss of life? And I was just kind of thinking, the EPA, my guess is misjudgments and bad policy at the EPA probably cause much more loss of human life than mass killings in the United States or even in the world do. The Affordable Care Act. I mean, this is going to, whether we have health care in this country that's accessible to people, makes an enormous difference in terms of people's mortality and their longevity. The Food and Drug Administration, the Federal Trade Commission, and one might also ask about military policy, which in some ways is almost the flip of the conversation that we're having around mass shooting and gun violence. Sort of anything goes when you're talking about mass shootings, gun violence, and people with mental illness. I mean, we don't really need to look at the science, look at the facts. It's very, I need to protect myself. We need to protect ourselves. Civil liberties, okay, there are civil liberties, but really protection is the issue here. Although, as the speakers have said, there's very little that we could do actually to prevent, perhaps nothing we could do to prevent mass shootings from people who are mentally ill or who are not. On the other hand, our military policy causes a lot of loss of life to both Americans and people who are not Americans, and there is kind of a very narrow range of acceptable conversation about military policy. And one has to sort of get behind politically America's role in the world, and you've seen this in elections and the positions that Obama has taken. But we have a lot more at stake in terms of mortality, as does the world in that debate. And it's interested me, and for what it's worth. So let me just say a little bit about the current legal scheme, because, of course, the proposals that are being made today are about changing laws. And I think it may be important to understand and build on what Sherry has said about what our current laws with respect to mental illness are. And the end of the story is there's relatively little left to be done to protect society from people with mental illness. Unless you're going to take steps that I think most people would be unwilling to take. Maybe call that a civil liberties issue, but it's just not the kind of society that most Americans are willing to live in and embrace. So first of all, we have, as Sherry said, we have civil commitment laws. If you're mentally ill and appear to be dangerous to self or others, likely to be dangerous to self or others, I'm not up on my mental civil commitment law these days. It may be that you have to prove this by clear and convincing evidence as opposed to a preponderance of the evidence. I see shakes yes. So there is kind of a heightened standard. Although I would tell you that if you've ever been to a civil commitment proceeding or watched any number of them, the idea that there's any serious standard of proof or heightened standard of scrutiny is a little odd, since almost everyone, not everywhere, and that is probably less true in the District of Columbia, maybe in New York where they have public defender panels that are aggressive in defending people, but almost everyone who's subject to a civil commitment petition gets committed. There are very few people who sort of beat the rap. So the process of civil commitment is largely a process of physicians identifying people likely to be dangerous, going through some motions, and getting committed. So then there's another body of law that's not involuntary hospitalization, but it's really about involuntary, what we call outpatient commitment. Essentially, you must take your medication and do what your treater says should be done, at least to the extent ordered by the court, in order to remain at large. And there the standard is something like dangerous to self or others, but also there's another standard that's in operation that is essentially that, for one reason or another, you are likely to become dangerous. And therefore, unless you take your medication, therefore we're going to order that you take your medication. And so because you lack understanding, or maybe we've seen this behavior in the past, someone's discharged from a hospital, they are stabilized on meds, they stop taking their meds, and they become dangerous to self or others. Mostly dangerous to self, rarely dangerous to others is the rationale. And they have some kind of impaired ability to make a treatment decision, which often in practice means that they say no to the medication. So we have outpatient commitment laws. And those outpatient commitment laws, I think, are in about 45 of the states. I can't remember if there are 4 or 6 states that now don't have outpatient commitment laws, although even those states may have laws that allow a similar result to occur as part of a hospital discharge. The framework is that you're on a leave from the hospital as opposed to even though you've been discharged, and so they can pull you back if you don't comply with taking medication. So that's the civil commitment standard and the outpatient commitment standards. Then you have, as a result of the Brady gun legislation, some pretty powerful and I would say kind of overreaching law that admittedly hasn't been widely implemented. In the first instance, I think, because a lot of state mental health authorities thought it was improper and were able to get states to not participate, that is, not submit the information to the federal crime check system or the federal background check system. So under the Brady gun law, and you probably heard some discussion about this, there's a database for gun checks, for gun purchase checks, ammunition purchase checks, and you get reported and you're unable to purchase gun or ammunition if you fall under one of 2 categories. One is if you are a mental defective. I think that's actually the language of the law. Bob says he is. Or if you've been civilly committed. Mental defective, I think, has been interpreted mainly to mean you're under some form of guardianship, which, as many of you know, doesn't necessarily indicate that you're someone who is in a condition that lay people would understand as mentally defective. Lots of people are under guardianship because someone else thinks it's best that they manage, usually a family member, that person's financial affairs. And we've actually been engaged in litigation about the rights of people under guardianship because many of them are pretty competent, including their right to vote. We've generally won those cases. Then, and interestingly, there's a proposal that was made some years ago that's apparently being revived, that people who have representative payees for SSI and SSDI should be part of this mentally defective group reported into the federal background database. And that's an enormous number of people. And those people are, I mean, there's not even any requirement that the people who have representative payees be incompetent in any way. It's just kind of for their convenience that someone else gets their check. And sometimes it's actually a residential facility that gets the check as a condition of their admission. And when it comes to civil commitment, then there's an issue, maybe someone on the panel knows how it's been resolved, but I think there's an active issue of whether it has to be an involuntary commitment or if a voluntary commitment, that is checking yourself into the hospital, would suffice. And if it's, I'm not quite sure what's considered a voluntary commitment, but that's a lot of people, a lot of commitments. Virtually anyone who's been hospitalized, I would think, would fall under that category. And I don't know how that issue has been resolved as a matter of federal law. I suspect it will be resolved in the future under the executive orders that the Obama administration has issued to bring within its sweep people who are involuntarily and voluntarily committed. I expect some further guidance on that will expand kind of the scope or the reach of those reporting requirements. So, to a certain extent, the Brady Act was really the the law that made the big difference here and required the reporting. And there was relatively little opposition to it, relatively little discussion of it, although, again, I think there's been inconsistent implementation of it, in part because of the wide range of concerns that people in the mental health community have about that law. So, from a matter of public policy, one might ask, what can we do about gun violence? As I said, I think there's little we can do about mass shootings because they're so infrequent and hard to predict. But there's a lot of gun violence, and presumably we can do something about that. And just from a logical perspective, one does something about guns or one does something about violence or both. And as Bob said, you can do something about guns. There are Second Amendment issues, and there's a lot of public policy discussion, and there's been some efforts made, and perhaps there'll be some national legislation. But there'll still be a lot of guns, even after any national legislation. When we get to violence, the one thing that we do know is that there's virtually no link between mental illness and violence. And so there's a debate, and some people say there's no link, some people say there's a small link, that some people who are untreated and also have substance abuse problems have a slightly heightened risk of violence. And even if that's true, we're talking about a small group of people, slightly heightened risk of violence, and I'm not sure anyone has compared that population to substance abusers in general. So it may be, many of us think it's the substance abuse that's the issue, not mental illness. But if we make public policy by identifying groups at heightened risk and then subjecting them to some kind of onerous or coercive legal scheme, people with mental illness don't seem like the right group. So Sherry and I were just talking beforehand. I mean, we now have the capacity through the wonders of Google and other forms of data to identify, let's say, zip codes where there's a lot of gun violence. We can probably profile people who are likely to commit gun violence. My guess would be that high on the list of predictors would be living in a community where there's a lot of gun violence, being poor, and being male, probably also being between the ages of 15 and 30, maybe 15 and 25. But we have that data. We could easily graph or chart the places in our society where there is a lot of gun violence. And if one took sort of the model of how we're treating people with mental illness, who have a very, either no heightened risk of violence or a very small one, what we would be saying is that, well, let's just go into those communities and call them gun-free zones. Might not be such a bad idea, but I think picking communities out based on high rates of violence would be a much more sensible, to eliminate guns or eliminate gun ownership would be a much more sensible public policy than taking away or then targeting people with mental illness. And of course, the other thing one could do, if one wants to take a step further and do some preventive detention, that would be a much more sensible group to confine without having committed a crime than people with mental illness, certainly people with mental illness who are not dangerous to self or others. And that's the group now that we're talking about in terms of gun control. So, we're done. Yeah, so I'll leave it to Anupa to talk about some of the impact of what we would call, I think, psychiatric profiling when it comes to the public discussion of gun violence and gun control. But I just want to say what I think are some of the real costs of this public discussion. I mean, one, there's a very public message, I think, that one should fear people with mental illness. And that is really heightening, I think, the stereotype that leads to a lot of discrimination in our society. I think the other cost is the point that Bob made, which is that we're very likely to discourage people from seeking care. We're really driving up, I mean, if you just want to use an economic model, we're driving up the cost of care. If you go seek mental health treatment, here's another set of bad things that may happen to you. And for some people, you know, we in Washington or we in this room don't think losing your right to have a gun is such a big deal. Some people, actually, it makes a difference to them. Policemen, people who want to be in the military, people who like to hunt. These are all reasons to essentially not go seek mental health care. And we're talking about a very significant number of people. And if really your concern is the mixture of mental illness and someone with a gun, it doesn't seem like a good public policy to discourage those people from seeking care. Thank you.
So I know it's getting, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So recently, Vice President Biden was in Connecticut talking about gun violence and the need for gun control legislation. And he said, it's not about keeping bad guns out of the hands of good people. It's about keeping all guns out of the hands of bad people. And so the real key question here is, who are these bad people? I mean, that's the question that's being addressed in legislation, in public policy, and by the medical profession. Everyone's asking, who are these bad people? So I'd like all of you to take a look around this room for a moment. Let's take a look, and I'm going to include all our viewers on the internet when I'm making some of these statements. So assuming that there's all of you plus whoever's online, there's like 100 people, right? So amongst these 100 people, 20 people have experienced some form of a mental illness. Now, if this was a room of 100 women, 23 would have experienced mental illness. And if it was all men, that would be 15. Amongst all of you, 100 people, plus online, 7 people have had a major depressive episode. 4 people have thought about ending their life. And 1 person has actually made a plan. But on the plus side, 13 people have sought treatment. So can any of you identify who those 20 people could be? Or those 4? Or the 1? I guess that probably you can't, right? And what that boils down to is it's really hard to identify who are the bad people. I mean, Ira was talking about guardianship. If we look at guardianship, Britney Spears is under guardianship. Now, her music is questionable, but are we scared of Britney Spears? But that's what a lot of all of these discussions are going to, right? Is saying that because of a certain diagnosis or because of what a doctor says, you are scary and threatening, and we need to take care of you. And some of these new laws are creating new mandatory ways of taking care of you. So let's say you're one of those 13 people who went out and sought treatment. Now, would it change your mind if you wanted to talk to a doctor, but you knew the doctor could report that information to the police? Would you feel comfortable having a conversation with him? Probably not. And would you feel comfortable if you knew that talking to one of your friends or your roommates could allow them to report you to a doctor who could then share all of your health information to the police? Make you a little scared to be open with your friends or your family members if you're going through a rough time. And it's been pretty recent since I graduated law school. But I know 1L year sucks. And it's hard and it's emotional. And you can have a lot of feelings. In my case, I had a friend who felt like it was actually her 3L year. Last set of finals. Felt completely emotional. And didn't know what to do with herself, didn't know how to handle it. And called me after taking a handful of sleeping pills. And said, I don't know what to do, I can't keep going. So I asked her, can I call the police? Can we take you to the hospital? She said yes. So we did that. She went to the hospital, she got treatment voluntarily, graduated from law school, and took the bar. But maybe under these new laws, things would change, right? We're not quite sure how they're exactly going to implement this, but would you feel as comfortable would she have felt so comfortable to talk about what's going on and admit herself into the hospital if she knew that might preclude her from taking the bar? Or if she knew that she'd be in some sort of a registry? Maybe make her think about it a little differently. And so a lot of what's going on is not just about gun control legislation. It's about profiling. And in terms of that profiling, when you get to a hospital, right, like we've heard about involuntary commitment, voluntary commitment, assisted outpatient treatment, but what does that actually mean, right? So let's say you are one of those 13 people. You did go to the doctor gave you medicine, right? We've all seen the ads for Zoloft where there's the rain cloud over your head, and then you take the Zoloft and the rain cloud goes away and your family's giving you hugs. Right? So medication's supposed to make everything better. But would you still take the medication if it was going to make you sleepy, makes you sick, makes you gain 60 pounds? Think about it. Do I really want this? Would you still feel like you want to take the medication if you have to drop out of law school because the medication slows down your brain so much that you can't think straight? Or that you might have a hard time getting a job because of it? I don't know. It'd be tough. But as Iris said, in terms of assisted outpatient treatment, that might be your only condition. The only way you could live at home is that you have to take something that someone else says is the only way that you're going to fit in and be normal and be okay and acceptable to society. And I question how right that is. And there's also all this talk about how taking medications is going to stop you from being violent. And we've heard that there's no way to predict violence, right? I mean, there's some indicators, but nothing hard and fast. And the truth is that actually some of the mass shooters in the past have been on medication, right? Eric Harris, one of the gunmen from Colorado, from Columbine, was taking Luvox. And Dylan Klebold had taken Zoloft and Paxil. Doug Williams, who killed and wounded 9 of his fellow Lockheed Martin employees, was on Zoloft and Celexa. So what does that actually mean? That what we're ultimately doing here is creating figuring out ways to say that this is what you guys should take because we're acting out of fear. And we can't identify who's bad. Now, I bet none of you in this room would be able to identify that I fit almost all of those categories of what is a bad person, right? I've been diagnosed and treated for a serious mental illness. I've been civilly committed, involuntarily committed, and voluntarily committed. I've been forced to take a ton of medication and had to drop out of work. I was told I could never go to school again. Right? I've tried to commit suicide over 7 times. Do I strike you as scary? Thank you.
Okay, so we've got some time for questions. So for those of you here in the room, we have these 2 microphones. And again, for those of you attending via the live webcast, please feel free to email questions to our HumLaw account, humlaw@wcl.american.edu, and we'll be sure to ask the panelists. I'll throw out a couple of questions. Those of you in the room, feel free to jump up and get in line for the microphones. I wanted to see what our panelists thought. I'm not sure if any of you saw this, but yesterday the New York Times had an op-ed with a couple of interesting ideas. The first was to prohibit individuals convicted of violent misdemeanors, so assault, battery, making violent threats with a weapon, from buying guns for 10 years after the conviction. And then the other was Pennsylvania law, which bars gun purchases by those who've been convicted of 3 or more drunken driving offenses within a 5-year period. So those are a couple of options they threw out counter to the mental health emphasis in the gun control law. So I want to see if any of you had thoughts. Also, if any of you had thoughts or reactions to the other panelists' presentations, let's open with that as well.
Well, I'll say 2 quick things. First, Anupa's reference to Britney Spears actually made me rethink my position. So that's the first thing. And I guess from the perspective of sort of the mental health community or the disability rights community, if there are solutions that don't target people with mental illness, fine, people can debate what those are. And I don't know that we have much to say about that. But there is a way in which, and so I think our greatest concern is being targeting people with mental illness. I have in front of me the kind of legislation that was passed by New York, the SAFE Act, Cuomo's legislation. Much of it addresses access to guns. There's some changes to mental health policy and to school safety issues. But the piece that everyone's been focused on is this amendment that says mental health professionals, which it turns out includes physicians, psychologists, registered nurse, or a licensed clinical social worker, currently providing treatment services, and I wasn't sure that was mental health treatment services, but let's assume it is. If they determine the person is likely to engage in conduct that will result in serious harm to self or others, then that person is reported to a community mental health director, and if that person agrees with the assessment, it gets reported to the police, and the police check to see if you have a gun, and they also list your name on the database so that you can't get a gun. So if that standard was a standard that we were going to use for everyone, I mean, I guess from a disability rights perspective, that's fine with me. So if people in general, your doctor or your minister, your neighbor, I don't know, someone who has a basis for making a judgment, says you are likely to engage in conduct that will result in harm to self or others, and on the basis of that you get reported to the police, and the police do something, that's okay. But this limits that scheme to people with mental illness. It's not a universal rule. And so the question is, why aren't we talking about universal rules here as opposed to rules that just target people with mental illness?
And since I know this is a human rights crowd, this issue actually comes up actually quite that way under the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which Article 14 essentially says, you cannot take actions, you cannot say involuntarily commit people on the basis of disability unless you do it with other people. You have to treat them the same. There's some question as to what that actually means, because I think what Ira's describing, what we were talking about earlier about generalized preventive detention, is not something we typically do. And so there's some consequences of that, but I think the point is that you cannot take this one characteristic and extract it from everything else and say this is so important that we have to act on people who have this condition in a particular way when there is no data suggesting that they are any more likely to be actually in the group of people who you have to be concerned about. So it is challenging, I think, sometimes to think about what these things may mean, but I think part of the problem is, again, the kind of vividness of this diagnosis or presumed diagnosis. And I want to say presumed as well because, the most recent crime, the Newtown, there's actually been, Adam Lanza was variously described as perhaps having autism, which there really is no connection with in terms of violence at all, and maybe having been troubled, and maybe his mother thought he was troubled, but these are all very vague kinds of things, and it's amazing how quickly many people in the media, I think, but not just the media, jump to the conclusions about what those things may mean. So I think that's really quite critical. I do think this question of predicting violence and dangerousness, there's one other aspect I think that we have to take into account, and that is what is the consequence of being wrong in either direction. So one of the worries I have is that if you put the burden on, let's say, mental health therapists to report people who they may think of as dangerous, well, if they do not report them, and those people go on to commit dangerous acts, they feel like there's really a focus on them. Why didn't you saw the person, you didn't act, how could you have let this happen? If you report it, and it turns out that you later recognized you were wrong, it turns out they weren't really dangerous, you might view that and say, well, okay, better to be safe than sorry. Of course, better for you, maybe not so much better for the person that you're reporting in that way. So I think, especially in the current environment, one of the fears I have is that it's just easier to protect oneself. And I don't mean in a way to suggest that people are acting in bad faith. I think it's just human nature that you would be more worried about, especially right now, in being identified as having been too soft on this issue rather than too hard on it.
Listening to Professor Dinnerstein's comments and responding to the question about the proposal in the New York Times, it leads me to address a couple of things. First, when you think about the right to own a gun as a fundamental right in American society, at least, it's a Second Amendment right. And when you think about the other things that we consider fundamental rights, all of the First Amendment rights, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to assemble, when you think about the personal integrity rights that we have under our 14th Amendment jurisprudence, one of the ways in the United States that we protect against invasion of those rights, what could be considered, I guess, human rights or what we call our fundamental rights, is that we have due process. You have an entitlement to seek a court, a judicial finding that your individual right is outweighed by some societal goal. And so as I'm listening to the description of the law in New York and these comments, one thing that I deal with in my work on a day-to-day basis is these conversations with doctors who are trying to put labels on things, on people, not things, but on people that fit this diagnostic and statistical manual. They're taking behavior and they're saying, I think this fits the criteria for major depression. And another person is saying, I think this fits the criteria for schizophrenia. And another person is saying, you know what, this person lost their job, they're getting divorced, their kid is failing out of school, it's all circumstantial, I don't even think they fit the criteria. So it's a very individual analysis by doctors who are better and worse than each other. Their quality varies, and the quality of their individual interactions with people varies. So the concept of having laws that restrict our fundamental rights based on this kind of very individualistic analysis that is not an exact science at all it's shocking to me that in the United States we would be even considering that. It flies in the face of all of our history of protecting individuals' fundamental rights. So just not from a disability rights perspective, but from a civil rights perspective, these proposals seem to make no sense. The proposal about someone who has 3 prior convictions makes more sense from that civil rights perspective than the idea that a doctor would be making a very subjective analysis of what's going on with a person, and we would, on the basis of that, be depriving someone of their fundamental right under our Constitution.
I want to make sure, Anupa, you get a chance to respond, but we did get a question from our webcast audience. So here's the question. In talking with legislators about this issue, how do we both say that there is no link between mental health and violence, and at the same time say that it is a good idea to increase funding for mental health services? Yeah.
Oh, no. I mean,
Okay. Good, go.
so the first part of the question just was, how do we...
Talking to legislators, how do we both say that there's no link between mental health and violence, and then also say that we need increased funding for mental health services?
So in terms of the no link, in my view, I think part of that is that if you look at the statistics, right, there's a lot of people who kind of fit the criteria of having a mental illness. But because of the stigma that we place on it, no one ever feels comfortable enough to come out and talk about having experienced depression or bipolar or schizophrenia or any of the other, those are like the sort of serious mental illness. But I think in order for us to start showing legislators that there is no link is also for people who've had some of these experiences to start coming out and talking about it. Because if you're a professional or you're having, a regular life, that's one way to show politicians that we're not all scary, right? And that's kind of the point that I was trying to bring across in my presentation. So I would say like that is the key bit, and then the second part was
increasing funding for mental health services.
And then in terms of the funding, I think we have to make sure that the kinds of services that we're looking at are quality services. So a lot of studies have shown that if you have inadequate services, that no one's going to really benefit from them. In my personal case, I actually had really great health insurance at the time, so I was able to go to some of when I went in voluntarily, I was able to go to some really great hospitals. But I've gone in voluntarily to Howard University, and that was like a place I wanted to get out of. And so that really, the quality of the treatment is more important than just throwing money at, different service providers who aren't doing anything. And also, I think we need to make sure that these services are voluntary, because a lot of, having a mental illness is really like you want to take the medication, you want to engage in therapy, you want to do these things. And so if you're just doing it because you're forced to, then it's just going to last for that period of time that you're institutionalized. But like, why would you want to do something after you're out? So those are some of the points.
Yeah.
Just a few
Real quickly, I mean, I think the voluntary quality of the services is very important because, we have medical or health services all the time. We don't think of requiring people to get treatment for health services. We try to make it clear why they might want to benefit, and they'll pick and choose if they have insurance for the kinds of services that they like. So better insurance coverage, which perhaps will come out of the Affordable Care Act, better services generally, and less focus on coercive services and more on voluntary, I think is important. The second is, it seems to me, we can have a kind of agreement to disagree, if you will, that those of us who don't think that there's the connection and we think we have the science on our side, having a dialogue with those who think there is. Either way, if you increase the good quality services, I suppose both sides could win. We can either be demonstrated to be right, or those who think there's a connection can be in that sense. So I think that it can be. And the last thing I'll say is that whatever else is true about the people who've come to our attention because of these crimes and others, we certainly ought to try to figure out a way to help people who are troubled get help if they want it, and provide the kind of supports they might need. So whether or not we think there's a link, that when you do read these stories, such as we learn about them, of people who had difficulties, had trouble, maybe tried to get help and didn't get it, we should be concerned about that as a society, which is a very different issue from saying we're going to act coercively toward them.
We have one question. This will be our last question. Yeah, is it?
Yeah. No, well, first I want to say thank you for telling your personal story. I actually dealt with mental illness, not myself, but family member. And he didn't quite make it because he didn't receive the help a little too late. But what I wanted to ask you from when I'm listening is that, prohibition, actually encourages isolation and stigmatism. And we know that doesn't work, I could tell you it doesn't work, especially in mental illness. So what I kind of thought from my personal experience, and I think y'all highlighted it, but y'all been focused on the law, but accessibility and encouragement is what is needed. And now accessibility is something that maybe funding could do, maybe better medicine. Instead of taking pills every day, I always thought, well, what if we could just take one pill and it just lasts for a longer period of time? That may be simplistic, but also encouragement, because I think there's a lack of understanding amongst everybody. And we're in a different society where we don't even speak to one another. And so therefore, that person ends up becoming isolated, and then he decides to act out. But I know, just like if we would reach out, but I just wanted to know y'all's thoughts on accessibility and encouragement, and what could we do from that?
Thanks.
I mean, two of the problems that I don't think more money is the solution in the sense of let's just throw more money at the problem, which makes it difficult, I think, sometimes to take advantage of whatever opportunity there may be. But people are having this conversation and trying to focus on what would make a difference. So two features of our system that are particularly problematic. The first is that help is very inaccessible unless you're really kind of at the end of the game. You're in psychiatric crisis and you're doing very, very badly. In many places, you essentially have to be dangerous to self or others to get any help. So you may have, the system prioritizes with its scarce resources, and the way those priorities tend to operate is the folks that get access particularly to the most intensive services and housing are folks who have repeatedly been in hospitals or are being released from jails and prisons. And so, this is why families are often counseled when their loved ones begin to have psychiatric crises, to essentially lie about their condition, to paint the picture as their loved one is violent when they're not, or that their problem is much more severe than it is. The second aspect of our system that's really troublesome is that it's still largely a system that expects people to fit, to come to it and to fit into what it has, as opposed to a system that does a lot of outreach that goes where places where people are, particularly using peers and paraprofessionals, and then asks people where they are, what can we do to help? mean, to the extent that there's outreach, it's usually, we don't like what you're doing, we're going to tell you to do something different, as opposed to, you seem to be in trouble, you're living on the street, or, you just got evicted, or whatever it is, you're having this difficulty with your family, how could we help? And there are services like that, and they're growing. And part of the difficulty of funding them is that we have so much money now invested in the more expensive institution-based and crisis-based system.
I want to add also, I think if we're really looking at how we can use money to change our existing services, and we're looking at this issue of mass shootings, the other common kind of thread with the most recent cases are people using these video games and being online a lot. And this is a whole other conversation, I think. Are we going to start monitoring what people are doing online and then restricting their access to guns based on what websites they've visited or what video games they've played, right? Like, that's as logical as the conversation we're having about mental illness. But I think that funding to adapt our systems of care to people's actual behavior could be beneficial. So if people are, and this is going to raise a whole host of issues, and I can see that Baslan probably has strong opinions about this, but if people are not willing to go out and meet face-to-face with a doctor, but they are spending a lot of time on the computer and accessing information in that way, what can we do? What systems can we build using funding that may become available to, get people services, an entry point that way? So those are the kind of ideas that come to my mind when I think about how we could use some changes that might cost some money. But again, it's an entire different conversation, I'm afraid. And that's coming off the top of my head, just like any one of you. It's not based on any professional expertise in how to access systems.
Yeah, go ahead. We'll just wrap up.
I'll be really quick. I think the one good thing that's actually kind of come out of all of this is that there has been a lot of media attention on the issue, and there have been calls for dialogue, right? Like the Huffington Post, the New York Times, both had editorials on, we want to hear from you, we want to know what's going on, let's start talking about this. So I think that's really kind of a good thing that's come out. And I want to second what Iris said around peer support, which is, I think, a great way to get access to some services, to have a person to talk to, and who's better than someone who's actually been in your shoes before. And I think my third point is that accessing psychiatric services before you're in that crisis stage has to be less expensive. I mean, if you're going to see a private psychiatrist and you don't have insurance, they can charge upwards of $300 for 30 minutes. And psychiatric medication in the U.S. as compared to other countries is incredibly expensive. A Zoloft for 30 days is $60. So I think we have to look at all of those factors together.
That's great. So we're a little over time, so I hate to cut off the conversation, but for those of you who are in the room, feel free to come up and talk to our speakers. I want to thank you all again for taking time out of your busy day to come and have this conversation. Thank you to those in the audience and to everybody on our webcast from afar. Thank you for attending. Thanks so much.